In this video, I want to talk to you about doing behavioral observations when you're collecting data for a study. Now, this is actually in Chapter 6 of the Morling book, and so there are pages that you're going to read ahead for this part. And it's probably best if you go ahead and read those first, and then watch this video. Now, some of the things I'm going to talk about aren't in your textbook, and they're methods of collecting behavioral observations. I do love that your book gets this right, in that while watching behavior can be used for just a descriptive study that's going to make a frequency claim, it can also be used in any other kind of study. This is just a way of collecting data. And if the data are behavior, then somebody needs to watch it and record it. And there's different ways you can do that. Let me give you an example. In my research back in graduate school, I watched monkeys eat, and I was interested in how they handled food they had never seen before. So it was novel food, and I wanted to know, are they careful with this food they've never had? Because most species are. You don't just see something new and eat it because you don't know if it's poisonous, if it'll make you sick, anything. So I had 3 different dependent variables in my various experiments. One was I counted when the monkey picked up a piece of food. I would count the number of times it tasted the food, which was operationally defined as putting the food to the mouth. I would count the number of times that they put the food to their nose, and I called that a sniff. I don't really know if they were smelling it or what, but if it went to the nose, I just counted it, and that's a frequency. I also did a duration, which is I counted how long it took from the time they picked it up till the time they either dropped the last piece of food or put the last bite in their mouth. I had a duration of basically how long were they handling the food. What else did I take? I also took data on whether or not the last thing they did with that one piece of food was drop a little bit or eat. So it was a drop or an eat. Did it all go in, or did some of it get left? Oh, I did one more measure. I did something called a latency. A latency is a special kind of duration. It's basically how long does it take something to start or begin. And so I took a latency between the time that they picked up the piece of food that was laying on the ground and they first took a taste of it. And so one of the results was that the animals are cautious around food because they took much longer between the time they picked it up, if it was a new food they'd never seen, and tasted it, put it to their mouth, where if it was a familiar food, a piece of fruit they'd had before, monkey chow or something, they'd just pick it up, and it would be very quick latency between the time of picking it up and putting it to their mouth. So that shows you 3 kinds of data collection techniques when you're watching behavior. You guys are actually going to have an assignment where you need to watch behavior. So let me review those collection techniques real quick. Okay. And again, these are just different ways of collecting data on behavior, which psychologists often want to do. We don't always want to rely on self-report. Sometimes people aren't very good at recalling their behavior or accurately reporting their behavior. So sometimes we want to just watch them and see what they actually do. So one is to simply count the number of times the behavior occurs. And this is going to be within a given time period. Now, if I was interested in something about how much my cat sleeps, my cat is actually sleeping on the floor right there. I could count maybe the number of naps she takes in a day, although I'd have to decide when does a nap start and end, like what's one thing. So some things lend themselves better or worse to frequency. It was very easy for me to count the number of times a monkey puts a piece of food to its nose. And that was another result of in all my experiments, that was something I always found, is if the food was new, I got a significantly more number of sniffs than if the food was something they were familiar with. And then I did that with a frequency method of collecting that behavioral data. Another one is to do duration. How long does it take, or how long does the behavior occur? And again, that might be better for my cat napping study I want to do on Smacky down here, is how long, what's the average nap time for her? You know, I may just do a duration. Now here I have that explanation of the latency, which is just a special kind of duration. You might do a latency, like let's say you're interested in taking data in a restaurant, how the servers, their behavior, how good a job they're doing. You might take a latency on how long does it take from the time you're seated at your table to the time the server comes to take your order, or the latency between sitting down and your food arriving at the table. That would be an example. Now, I want to tell you about another data collection technique. This is going to sound kind of funny, but we'll explain it. An interval method. Now, what you do with an interval method, I'll let you read the thing here, is I'm going to say, okay, I'm going to watch the data for an hour or 2 hours, 5 hours, whatever it is, a whole day. I'm going to take that observation period and divide it up into equal intervals. Now, let's say I do an hour. I could have 30 2-minute intervals. I could have 2 30-minute intervals, but that would be stupid. No one would do that. I could have 60 1-minute intervals. I could have 12 5-minute intervals. The length of your interval just depends on the behavior, what makes sense for what you're doing. Now, once I have that set up, what I'm going to do is I start my stopwatch, and within each interval, I'm only going to record yes or no, did the behavior occur? This is sometimes called 1-0 sampling, and people put a 1 in the box if it happened and a 0 if it didn't. Sometimes they'll just use any codes they want, but all you're recording is did it happen, yes or no, in each interval. And then at the end, what you're going to report is what percentage of intervals did the behavior occur. Now, there's some times when this makes a lot of sense. So if a behavior is kind of messy, it's sort of hard to know when it exactly starts and stops. The duration might not make sense. Or there's lots going on and you just need a little bit of data. You do lose some detail when you're using interval method. It's a little bit easier, but you may still capture enough of what you need. So let's say one of the examples I'll use in your son is, I'm taking data on my roommate swearing at the TV during a UT football game. I want to know how much or how often was something about this, swearing behavior. And maybe it's, it takes, sometimes it's just one word, sometimes it's a whole barrage of, yelling. And I just decide I don't really want to take that much time and get that much detail. I'm just going to do an interval method. So for the duration of the football game, every, let's say 5 minutes, if my roommate at any time during those 5 minutes swore at the television, and I can operationally define that, like what's a swear word, I'll put a check. And if not, I'll put a dash. Okay. So I do that. And the nice thing is, so I start my stopwatch and I'm paying attention to my roommate for those first 5 minutes. If at 2 minutes and 10 seconds into the interval, you go, and I go, doop, okay, this interval, it did happen. Now I can just sort of not pay attention until the next interval starts because I already got a behavior. What interval recording does not do is count the number of times within each interval that the behavior occurs. It's just yes or no. It happened at least once or at all, or it did not happen. And this does give you some reasonable information on behavior. All right, now I want to talk a little bit about sort of the business of doing behavioral observations. And I'm going to use an example. When I was in Atlanta, I had students go down and watch the behavior of some drill baboons and gorillas as they were feeding and what kind of social behavior went along. And we were particularly interested in the young animals and the adults and what kind of social information might have gone back and forth about feeding. So we were taking data on feeding and social behavior. Now what I have here is one of the data books from my students. And I want to show you some things in here. One of the first things we have here is called an ethogram. An ethogram lists, pull this down a little bit, all the behaviors that we're interested in recording data about. Now, we weren't interested in everything the animals did. We didn't care about grooming or sleeping or fighting or any of that stuff. All we cared about was feeding behavior and some social behavior around feeding. So what this ethogram has is a list of behaviors with operational definitions. So we would record every time the animal picked up, sniffed, tasted, eat, or dropped a piece of food. We would also record what kind of food it was, and we did that in categories. So we called it forage if it was food that the keepers had, chopped up and thrown into the cage. We called it, we just used the term not forage, but we had a term for if they were eating food that was just in the cage, like plants, bugs, things they just found that weren't put there by the zookeepers. But they were edible. Then we had a category for inedible objects. This would have been like straws. Well, they don't have straws there, but zoo maps, just objects, rocks, things that would be in the cage that they would mouth, and we called that inedible. And then we had unknown, and that was the animals eating something. You just couldn't see it, so you had to call it. We just said, we don't know what it was eating. And then for the social behavior, and we color-coded these too. You'll see in a minute how that worked. We wanted to know social behavior when the animal we were watching, which is called your focal animal, who are you watching right now and taking data on right now. If that animal approached another animal who was eating and doing stuff, we would record certain behaviors, like if they smelled the other animal's hand, if they did what we call muzzle behavior. In the drill baboons, they have these big noses, kind of like German shepherds, and sometimes they go up and they'd sniff, and we would call that muzzle. And one of the outcomes was that the little animals, like the 1, 2, and 3-year-old, would do that about 82% of the time if there was muzzle behavior. First of all, the one that initiated it was doing it to another animal who was eating. So it seems to be it's related to not just sort of greeting and, hey, how you doing? It seems to be like, hey, what are you eating? So that was interesting. And it was the young ones that would come up and sniff the older animals. The older animals hardly ever went and sniffed a young animal. Usually they would just sniff somebody else, or I guess they did occasionally, but more often than not, it was the little guys who were making that initiation. So that was interesting. We basically were finding that the young animals are the ones who are making all of the effort in kind of finding out information about food from the older animals. There was hardly anything in the other direction. So, and then we would have those same behaviors if the animal we were watching was approached by another animal. We also recorded whether or not animal ate a piece of food that had recently been discarded by another animal, like dropped, or was in proximity. And our operational definition, so let's see, proximity, where is it? We wrote that if the animal we were watching picked up a piece of food that was within 20 centimeters in front of another animal. And it couldn't be to the side or behind, it had to be just right in front of it, because like us, other primates sort of have this thing about like ownership. And if something's sitting right in front of you, it's kind of yours. And so for another animal to come up and pick up food that's sitting right in front of you, and if you tolerate that, that's kind of significant. So to do these observations, first of all, we had a schedule. And this is actually for the drill baboons. We had the animals we were watching, and we can only get in 3 samples a day, because the animals would come out at about 10 in the morning. They were let outside, and there'd be food all over their cage. And we would just stand where the zoo visitors stood, because that was the best place to see the animals. And so they'd come out and they'd start eating, and there was all this activity. But after about an hour and a half, most of the food was eaten, and at that point they're just kind of sleeping and grooming and not doing anything that we're interested in. So our data collection was just these short, periods at the beginning of every day. So we had to go to the zoo and get your data. So we could fit in about 3 20-minute focal samples, 3 animals that we watched 20 minutes each. So you'd start your sample, and what we did, the behavior happens pretty quickly, and you don't really want to miss stuff. So we would sit there with a tape recorder and our stopwatch. And then we actually even had little binoculars, because if they were at the other side of the cage, it was hard to see sometimes exactly what they were eating. So we'd be sitting here holding these binoculars and tape and be like, pick, sniff, carrot, and we were saying these little codes into the tape recorder. And it was pretty funny, because we're standing where everyone else stands. And the zoo's pretty quiet on summer mornings, except then like a cold class of, preschoolers would come, and they're all around you, and you're like trying to take your data. It was pretty hilarious and annoying at the same time. But so we'd do 3 a day, because that's pretty much all we could get. And we would randomize who we were doing, because you don't want an order effect. You want to have every animal be first, second, and third an equal number of times. You want to randomize it so there's no possible bias in who you're watching. You might go, oh, that animal's easy to see, let me watch him. That could be biased. We want random assignment to the observation period. What else do we want? Well, so this would tell us each day, okay, who are we watching today? Who are we watching first, second, and third? And then we would sit there and take our data into the tape recorder. And the nice thing is you can pause it when you're not saying anything or nothing's happening. And so 20 minutes might take 25 minutes to actually occur, because kind of like a basketball game. If they go out of sight for some reason, you have to stop your stopwatch. You can't let the time run down when you can't see your animal. So I might have to, stop it and then move, find a better position. You're like, oh, there they are, start it again. Now, we had rules about if you had to, I can't remember, it was a while ago, but the rule might have been if your 20-minute focal sample took more than 30 minutes, we just scrapped that data, because we might be missing something really important about their feeding behavior, so we just couldn't count that as real data. So once we were done, all the data was on this tape recorder. And so then we would sit down and listen to it right away, usually just sit there at the zoo and do it. And we would write down what was on the recorder. We'd listen to it, and we would have little sort of shorthand notation about all the behaviors, and we write it down. So let's see, this says like, how about here? It says pick wood, taste drop, Mona look, wood, look, Mona unknown, what's that? Renata, Mona, reach, Mona reach. So these, and then they're color coded again. The yellow and the green tell us, was our animal the one initiating the behavior, or was somebody approaching our animal initiating? The blue is just when our animal is eating something. And so we have to listen to it, write down our little notation, and we color coded it to make it easy. And then at the top of each, this is our just data collection form. You can make up whatever you want your form to look like. At the top, we would summarize the behaviors from these two sessions, okay? And that made it easy then. Once we were ready to analyze data, I'm going to be putting data into SPSS or an Excel file, and I'm just looking at these, the totals and putting them into a spreadsheet, and then I can run some statistics on them. Now, what I want you to appreciate here is think about all the steps we just went through. First, we had to operationally define the behavior in a way that all the observers understand, and they're collecting data the same way. Okay. So we have to, get good on seeing the behavior. We have to see it. Okay. If you look away, some kid's distracting you, or if we were looking down to do something, maybe we'd miss it. So you have to see it. You have to say it. You have to be able to hear it on the tape recorder. There were a couple times when school groups came in and they were so loud, I couldn't hear my data, and I lost that observation period. So I learned, like, talk loud into the tape recorder. So I had to say it. I then had to listen to it and be able to understand what I had to write it down. Then I totaled it. So I went through and counted and wrote it at the top of the sheet. Then I had a student in my office, like, reading out the totals as I typed them into the Excel. And then I went ahead and did statistics. Now think about it. Every step of transferring that information is a place to make a mistake. Right? I could have totally screwed up and typed the wrong thing, heard the wrong thing, saw the wrong thing. So there's this reality of behavior happening. And then I am the recorder. The behavioral observer is the recorder. You're like the bathroom scale that's recording, showing somebody their weight, or you're like the ruler who's showing you, telling you how long is this thing, right? I am the instrument. And if I'm not very good, if I'm not reliable, if I miss things, I didn't see them, if I mishear myself, if I miswrite or mistype, the reality and the data, there's a lot of place for mistakes. So you have to be very careful about doing this and do a really good job and double check things, okay? Because we're going to make conclusions based on the data and the statistics. And that has to represent what we think we saw. So there's a lot that goes into it. It takes a lot of time, and it takes practice to get good at it. All right, I think that's all I really need to go over for you guys to be able to, have done the reading, look at the behavioral observation lab. You're going to pick a behavior and take some data on it. And I want you just to pick whether you do a frequency, a duration, or an interval method. Just pick one of those that you think makes the most sense for your for the behavior you're interested in. And there's some examples on the assignment, so you should be good.